Ladies and gentlemen, this is a really wonderful moment. A very warm welcome to all of you. I think all of you being here speaks volumes. It is in itself a very special welcome for you, Mr. Steinmeier, and it is also a very telling sign of the fact that transatlantic cooperation is nothing just of the past, but something very much of the future as well. I would like to welcome you here today on behalf of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation to our exchange with Dr. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the leader of the opposition in the German Parliament, who will speak to us on Germany, Europe, and the future of transatlantic relations. Many thanks to you, Heather, for yet another wonderful cooperation. My name is Pia Bungarten. I'm the head of the Washington office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, Germany's oldest political foundation. We are a think and do tank, committed to the values of social democracy and working with a network of over 80 offices around the world. Dialogue is our key method, and so we are right at home here at the Women's Democratic Club, which for over 90 years has offered a forum for lively discussion. I hope, Mr. Steinmeier, you will also feel right at home, because many of your colleagues have spoken here, including Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright. Your visit here is taking place at a moment of transition. One of many factors currently driving changes in the world is the Euro crisis and the way in which it is transforming the role of Germany in Europe. Two rather interestingly contradictory perceptions of Germany have evolved as a result and are circulating. There is Germany the hegemon, and there is Germany the wimp. Some accuse Germany of coming on way too strong, of being a bully who rams policies down the throats of Southern Europeans whose situation has worsened as a result instead of improving. Even Northern Europeans who accept the substance of Germany's positions worry at times about being marginalized by the fast-moving processes of decision-making dominated by Germany. But there's the opposite perception as well. Not Germany the hegemon, but Germany the wimp. Too hesitant to accept its new political responsibilities, especially in foreign and security policy, too timid, too weak on ideas, given to wishful thinking about being something like a big Switzerland. In times of change, it is absolutely crucial that we intensify our efforts of talking with each other to figure things out, which is why we are so very grateful that you have come to Washington, Mr. Steinmeier, and that you have agreed to speak to us today. Frank-Walter Steinmeier is a real, not just a fair-weather friend of the United States. He does not just pay lip service to transatlantic partnership. He is stuck with transatlantic cooperation in good times and in not such good times. Mr. Steinmeier started his career as head of the Chancellery of the German state of Lower Saxony, where the Social Democrats have just regained power. A key trial run for our elections in September, and might I add, I think a good omen. He went on to run the Federal Chancellery in Berlin, where his many responsibilities included coordinating German intelligence services. He then served as foreign minister of the Grand Coalition as of 2005, after having already taken on key foreign policy responsibilities in the post-9/11 years. Despite the widespread and deep skepticism of the German public, for example, he upheld and he deepened Germany's commitment to the efforts of bringing security to Afghanistan as a reliable partner and ally of the United States. During the conflict with the US government over the 2003 intervention in Iraq, he always maintained a close cooperation with the American administration. He worked tirelessly to re-establish mutual trust, cooperating closely, among others, with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, for example, in the 5+1 group that put increasing pressure on Iran while avoiding further escalation in the Middle East. He was then, and he still is, a trusted partner in that region. Both Israelis and Palestinians listened to him. Frank-Walter Steinmeier got to know President Obama before he was elected president, and he invited him to come to Berlin, where he gave his first great speech in Europe, and might I add, I was there. Very proud of that. Mr. Steinmeier is now the leading of the opposition in the German Bundestag. As we chart our new course in unfamiliar waters, there are very few people who are more trustworthy and more respected as navigators than Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He's not just a very skilled, experienced, and successful political leader, he's also an exceptionally wise and decent man. As you know, we will have elections in Germany later this year, electing a new federal parliament. And frankly speaking, I'm curious and rather hopeful regarding the position he might hold when we next welcome him to Washington. Mr. Steinmeier, the floor is yours.
Yeah, many thanks, Pia, for your wonderful introduction and your extremely kind words about your guest. I should be a little ashamed, although everything is correct. There's nothing to deny or to delete, but to start now in a more serious way, dear friends. It's great to be back here. Great to be back in Washington, and thank you all for your coming. Ladies and gentlemen, I really feel privileged for having this opportunity to switch on. Better? I really feel privileged for having this opportunity to address such a distinguished gathering, and I would like to thank, first of all, the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for organizing this big event. As Pia told you in her opening remarks, I have ever been here in Washington so often, and I have always been caught up in its unique spirit. Every visit, the meetings with your think tanks here in Washington were and are an intellectual challenge. There is probably no city in the world where politics is discussed more passionately and on a more informed basis than here. And this may be, in the same way, one of the reasons why Washington is not every day and everywhere in the rest of the country the most beloved capital. I'm here at an extraordinary, interesting time as President Obama embarks on his second term of office. Yesterday, in his State of the Union address, President Obama made it strikingly clear that he is not interested in simply carrying on as before. He faces difficult tasks, consolidating the budget, fighting for new jobs, strengthening the real economy. Now also, however, if he likes it or not, the fight for legacy begins. And this is a matter of a long view, or let's say the strategic dimension of politics. In Germany too, you heard it, we are at the beginning of an election year which promises to be quite exciting. One thing is already clear from my point of view. Since the state election in Lower Saxony 3 weeks ago, Angela Merkel and her coalition have already lost their majority in our second chamber, in the Bundesrat. And despite her undoubted popularity, politically speaking, concerning legislation, she is, as you say here, a lame duck. Whatever the outcome of the elections in September, one thing is certain: as from September 2013, there will be a different constellation shaping German politics. And I'm quite sure that my party, the German Social Democrats, will be a governing party at the end of the year. 2013 is said to be a year in which a new course is charted in both in Germany and American politics. But if I'm not mistaken, we also stand at the crossroads in transatlantic relations. I do not think I will offend anybody if I say quite boldly that the transatlantic relationship has known better times. In recent years, Europe and the USA have each been primarily fixated inwards on themselves. In Europe, political energies have been almost completely absorbed by the economic and monetary crisis, a subject I will return to in a little more detail in a moment. In the USA, on the other side, continues to suffer from the aftermath of the Lehman Brothers shock. Those who, after these events, still had the strength to look to the world beyond their own borders, talked about the end of the Atlantic era, or about the famous pivot to Asia, where foreign policy was discussed at all. Then it was about China and its future role in the world. Transatlantic, that was something for the old man from the East Coast. The music was being made somewhere else. That was how the situation was until just recently. But if I'm not deceived, signs are just emerging of a rebalancing. It is apparent to me from the discussions surrounding the recently published Global Outlook 2030 that Asia continues to be a focus of interest for America. That's true, that's normal, that's necessary. Yet I also detect that there may be some who question whether in terms of its foreign policy interests, America has perhaps overstressed its pivot to Asia. Those people are wondering if this is a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Is an American policy that favors its Trans-Pacific over its transatlantic leg in danger of losing its balance and stumbling to the detriment of its own country and the rest of the world? The weekend before last, I was at the security conference in Munich, sitting on a panel with, for instance, Bob Zoellick. A little bit later, your Vice President Joe Biden gave an impressive speech there, a rousing call to revitalize the transatlantic partnership. Very different from the customary platitudes which we all know and are sometimes tired of hearing. I at least detected a new tone, openness, curiosity, but also great expectations in terms of strategic responses from the old continent. I'm here to give my answer to Joe Biden's question in his speech in Munich. My party and I myself will try to match your American openness with our own openness, your curiosity with our curiosity, and your expectations with our own offers for talks and action. We want to place the transatlantic partnership on a new, robust footing. And we know that it has to be based on more than an endless repetition of old oaths of loyalty. The future of transatlantic relations depends on whether we succeed in finding common responses for tomorrow, responses that are based on a strategic vision. The figures speak clearly. More than 50% of all direct investments in the USA come from Europe. And the same applies in the reverse direction. The USA and Europe are, despite all the gloomy predictions of the decline of the West, they are the two largest and most closely interconnected economic areas. Then there are the historical, cultural, and personal interconnection, denser than with any other region of the world. Yes, the dynamism of Asia and parts of Central and South America are impressive. The rise of China and other new powers is happening at a breathtaking pace and speed. Yet, the development differential between these countries compared with our developed economies is still enormous. But we are strong, and if we are smart, together we will be strong in 30 or 40 years' time. I'm not one of those who talk in culturally pessimistic undertones about the West and the rest. It is not my style to indulge in decline and fall scenarios. The history of the West has always been the history of an open system with the capacity to learn a history of crisis, upheavals, and the ability to begin again. There is nothing to suggest that this history is about to an end. In recent years, the continent of Europe, the old continent of Europe, has been hitting the headlines mainly with bad news. I know how impatient and irritated people here in Washington were about European crisis management in the last years. Indeed, there is much to criticize. Often we Social Democrats too might have wished for faster and more courageous action on part of the German government. But whatever particular criticism we may have had, we gave our support to the key bailout measures, and we ultimately voted in Parliament with the government. Why? Because we knew that with the various rescue packages, it would have been irresponsible to look only for a short-term political capital out of the situation. This was, after all, a matter of the basic strategic orientation of German policy, and responsible action in these 2 years, last years, was needed. That was a sort of specific German bipartisanship, if you like it. European integration was our answer in the past to years and centuries of bloody conflict and civil wars. It has brought our continent more than 60 years of peace and prosperity. It has made possible the reunification of our country and our continent. One does not risk such a project lightly in a situation of crisis. To help you understand better what is going on in Europe at the moment, I invite you to look back beyond the recent past. Since the beginning of the 90s, ladies and gentlemen, European integration has made giant strides. And it was economic integration that set the pace. 20 years ago, in 1993, the single market was created. 18 years ago, in 1995, border controls were scrapped in large parts of the EU. 12 years ago, 2002, the common currency, the euro, was introduced. But you know that there was still no common economic policy, as member states insisted on their right to retain sovereignty over setting their own taxes and their own budget. Many economists were rightly critical, especially on this. But at that time, in the 80s and 90s of the last century, we went as far politically as we could. Politics, you know, that operates very often not in the realm of the desirable, but sometimes rather of the possible. The internal market and the euro developed their own dynamism. In 2003, Germany, in those days under social democratic leadership, brought in welfare and labor market reforms and improved our country's competitiveness. We turned from being the sick man of Europe to the continent's powerhouse. The foundation for our present strength now, in these days, were laid 10 years ago. Other countries, such as Italy or Spain or Greece, experienced an euro bonanza, benefiting for 10 years from low interest rates and ran up the debts. By 2010, at the latest, it had become already clear that things could not go on that way, that if they were no function properly, a single currency and an internal market also needed stronger economic policy coordination with stricter rules on prudent housekeeping, but also with a new instrument of solidarity. And it is precisely these rules of solidity and solidarity that are being argued over at this time. This is a complicated process which needs time. And when I look at politics here in the USA, it's the same way. However, I can say what you know only too well, that political progress often proceeds at snail's pace. You have your fiscal cliff here in the USA. Our cliffs in Europe are perhaps not as high, but they exist in 27 capital cities. And each of these cliffs has to be conquered at the end. In Germany, it is common to hear people complaining that too much is expected of Germany in terms of aid and solidarity. The federal government itself tends to take the same line. Of course, it is true that Germany's resources too are limited and its possibilities finite. You here in Washington know what it is like when the whole world comes knocking at your door with huge expectations and you look anxiously at the red figures in your own budget. Yet when I speak in public, rather than joining in with the litany of complaints, I try instead to point out a few simple truths. The most important truth is that Germany has been the greatest beneficiary of the European single market. And that continues to be the case right up in the present day, and increasingly so. According to IMF forecasts, the German GDP will rise by 10% per head of population between 2007 and 2016. In France, the GDP is stagnant. In Italy, it is set to fall by 9%. In Spain, by 6%. It is true that we have diversified our exports in recent years, but, ladies and gentlemen, still more than 50% of our exports go to our European neighborhood. And for this reason alone, we cannot afford to be indifferent to what happened there. We will soon know what is happening from our wallets if a mood of hopelessness is allowed to grip countries like Italy, Spain, or Portugal. If political instability sets in, and if there is a threat of years of stagnation. We cannot be indifferent in this. And I should also add, by the way, that even now, in the middle of the crisis, we are among the winners in this crisis. Last year, Germany registered net inward migration of, for the first time, by the way, of 400,000 people. Most of this number came not from Turkey and not from Northern Africa, but from the neighboring European countries. Young Spaniards, Portuguese, and Greeks are learning German in large numbers, coming to us well-educated, motivated people who see no future any longer in their home countries. We are at the moment experiencing something like the beginning of a true European labor market. People are moving to where there is work, and that means they are coming to us, to Germany. In doing so, they are cushioning us from the impact of the demographic change in Germany, which is just beginning to be felt on the German labor market. This is not yet a big topic in Germany, and the trend is still quite new. But naturally, Spain, Portugal, and others will only accept this development, which makes, from the economic point of view, some sense, will only accept that if there is also some kind of quid pro quo, and not only brain drain out of Spain or Portugal or others. Where regions and countries experience very different economic development, there has to be a transfer of prosperity. This applies within a country, but it also applies within a common economic area. If we cannot manage to act in a spirit of solidarity, the economic imbalance will grow until a point at which it can no longer be managed, even politically. I don't want to get into any more detail at this point. European politics, you know, that is a difficult subject. My brief canter through recent European history was intended to highlight one thing in particular. Firstly, what is happening in our continent is exciting. Secondly, it is important to take a long view. Whether or not, in the end, we arrive at something like the United States of Europe is academic. For me, it is enough to know what will happen over the next 10 or 20 years. And here I'm quite certain the European train will continue to run, and the direction in which it travels will be, from my point of view, towards a more closely integrated Europe, and one which based, hopefully, on greater solidarity. My plea to you is, please ensure that the USA retains its traditionally friendly stance to Europe. Support for European integration has been, from my point of view, a fundamental constant of American policy on Europe since Truman and Marshall. We German, all Europeans, and also the USA have an interest in the success of this great peacekeeping and civilizing project. What does that mean? You are waiting for that, for the transatlantic relations. First of all, I would like to put it to you that despite all the talk of widening Atlantic rift, the basic trend, as far as our societies are concerned, is, I'm convinced, towards convergence. Whatever our differences, the Atlantic is not growing any wider. Rather, our societies are growing closer together. To give one example, ladies and gentlemen, there are, at the present time, over 10 million people living in Germany today who came to Germany after they were born. That is around 12% of our population. And it is, believe it or not, exactly the same as the percentage of foreign-born people in the USA. What do I want to say by that? We are simply becoming more American. Even if most people do not recognize it in Germany. Germany today, like the USA, is a country of immigration. That is, on the one side, an extraordinary chance. On the other side, you know that better than we, creates problems. It may be a difficult truth for the conservatives in Germany to swallow, but sealing ourselves off is not an alternative. Our social peace, our future prosperity depend on whether we accept the fact of immigration and make immigration to one of our top issues which we have to deal with politically in the future. The problems which confront us politically in the coming years in Europe and America also bring us, I'm convinced, closer together rather than dividing us. Since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, we are all grappling with the questions of how to control the financial sector, which has got dangerously out of hand, and how to redefine its relationship with the real economy. When it comes to regulating the financial markets, Europeans and Americans will not always take exactly the same path. I know that. But in view of the interconnectedness of European and American financial worlds, it is very much in our common interest to ensure that the rules we set ourselves, if not identical, are at least convergent and compatible. The same applies to the question of sustainable and resource-efficient growth model. I'm not one of those for whom growth has a negative connotation. Our societies need growth, including, from my point of view, industrial growth. But take climate protection. Simply carrying on with the old growth model will take our planet to the brink of catastrophe. I know, of course, that your discussion on energy policy is very different from ours in Germany, particularly in light of the shale gas revolution here in the USA. But that does nothing to alter the simple truth that the survival of humanity depends on whether we are able to switch to a new sustainable growth path. And this is not about highly philosophical discussions. This is about quite practical questions, about a large number of small, but in their totality, decisive steps. We need new materials, new product designs, new drive and storage systems. This is where not only policymakers, but also our researchers and engineers need to step up to the plate. There are nearly 1.5 million people in both Europe and the USA working in research and development. That represents huge potential, and it is up to us whether the human spirit of invention succeeds in reconciling progress and growth with the conservation of life's vital resources. What a task, ladies and gentlemen, and what a huge triumph for all of us if we succeed, and we must succeed. I welcome the fact that the discussion on establishing a transatlantic free trade zone is gaining momentum once more, and that President Obama has yesterday announced to support and re-energize this project. Whatever the difficulties to be overcome in particular areas, we know them all, GMO and chickens and so on. Whatever the difficulties to be overcome in particular areas, this project has huge potential for creation of growth. I believe that it is important precisely because the Doha round negotiations have reached a deadlock or a dead end or whatever it is, that the USA and Europe should send out a signal in favor of free trade and back it up with action. The dismantling of non-tariff barriers to trade is almost more important than the abolition of customs duties, which are in any case already quite low. We are a common economic area which is still responsible for half of the world's GDP. If we agree on common standards and licensing procedures, particularly in the sensitive areas of environmental protection and product safety, this will send out a signal for corresponding agreements with Latin America, the Asian countries, and the rest of the world. In his speech in Munich, Joe Biden said, "We are going to be both a Pacific, but even so, an Atlantic power." When I heard this, I had half joking but half serious response on the tip of my tongue, which I have to share with you. And we are going, my words, and we are going to be both too. Europe is an Atlantic power, yes, but above all, it is a small peninsula of Asia. The world is round, and the routes to the new centers of growth in the global economy do not lead only across the Pacific or from Europe, from the view of Europe, not only through the Suez Canal. I strongly advocate that European policy should have a stronger focus on Asia and the Pacific. I believe that beyond business relations, Europe would be well advised to do more on the diplomatic front to fly the flag. Whether it is a situation on the, for instance, Korean Peninsula, who other than us Germans really has an experience of decades of partition and reunification? Be it the situation on the Korean Peninsula or the conflicting territorial claims between Japan, South Korea, and China, or the countries bordering the South China Sea, the voice of Europe certainly carries weight in that region. I, at any rate, would plead for us to be more proactive here in future, not forcing ourselves on anyone, but offering our experience of peaceful conflict resolution on a continent which was once the world's most warlike. The same applies to Central and Northern Asia. During my time as German Foreign Minister, I was already working on the development on a Central Asian strategy for the EU. This was making quite good progress at that time, 5-6 years ago. But in recent years, unfortunately, there has been little movement. Perhaps because of lack of interest or a lack of commitment or whatever. That is Central Asia. Our Russia policy had and has an Asian dimension. Russia, after all, is the largest Eurasian power. Even under the Tsars, Russia saw itself as a bridge from Europe to Asia and the Pacific. There is much to suggest that this bridging function will become even more important in the next future. As China's hinterland develops, there will be very new economic prospects for North and Central Asia. Countries like, for instance, Mongolia are suddenly becoming interesting. We are witnessing the development of new transport routes. The talk of new Silk Road is merely a symbolic expression of all of this. President Putin recently raised the subject of reviving the Northeast Passage, which was used during the Soviet time already. It is too soon to say when such a project will pay off. But one thing is clear. The Asian continent is being resurveyed politically, in terms of infrastructure, and economically. We are on the verge of a major geopolitical upheaval, and we Europeans and the USA, in the same way, have a fundamental interest in ensuring we are not simply passive bystanders. I know that, for instance, our call for a dialogue with Russia tend to raise eyebrows here in the USA. I know that. But remember, even in times that were more difficult in the past, more difficult than today, I used to say to American discussion partners, it is, if you like it or not, our fundamental interest in the West not to break the threads of communication and cooperation with Russia. And that means, especially for Germany, if we like it or not, Russia stays an important neighbor, which we, from its importance, which we cannot ignore. And in addition to that, I believe in the long run that Russia needs our cooperation to open up and develop its vast country, to build civil society and develop, perhaps far away, the rule of law in Russia. How to create a strong and stable Mittelstand. How to create a strong and stable economic middle class was, for instance, one of the questions I had to answer on a panel in Moscow 2 or 3 weeks before Christmas last week. How to create a stable Mittelstand, a stable middle class. That are questions which are on the table there. But whatever difficulties we may have with the current Russian leadership, which I do not seek to play down, we need patient strategic vision and understanding of our long-term interest in that region. There is still much more ground that I would have liked to cover. Afghanistan, Europe's role in the Middle East and North Africa, the need for Europe to take on more responsibility in this, our neighboring region. Enough time to go through all the conflicts in this world. We have it not in these 30 or 40 minutes. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, what I have tried to do is to make clear to you a position, and this is a position of strategic courage and I call it informed confidence. From my point of view, the only way we will be able to hold our own in the future. We watch as before our eyes a new world is being created, and we should do everything we can to shape and influence this development in line with our values. That is in our interest. But there is even more at stake. Europe and America stand for democracy and liberty, for an open society based on the principle of solidarity, for equality of opportunity, and for the right of the pursuit of happiness. These are the values of the West. But these are also the values without which there can be no better and more peaceful world. It is my conviction, our shared history, the history of the West, is far from over. On the contrary, we are now embarking on a new chapter. Many thanks for your attention.
Dr. Steinmeier, thank you so much. What a tour de force that was. My name is Heather Conley. I'm the director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we are delighted that you are here despite the rain, despite, I'm sure, a little late night last night, staying up watching the State of the Union address. I think this speaks to the power of the U.S.-German relationship. It speaks to your star power, Dr. Steinmeier, but it also speaks to the importance of the transatlantic relationship. We could not be more pleased to be in partnership with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And Pia, I loved your provocative remarks in the beginning. That was wonderful. Now, CSIS has a slightly different take. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is the think and do. My colleague Tony Cordesman says that CSIS puts the tank in think tank. So maybe we have a little different perspective there. But we're absolutely delighted to be here. I don't know if I would consider Germany the hegemon or Germany the wimp, Pia, but I do believe Germany the important. And important because the direction of German policy will tell us very much about the future direction of Europe. It will also tell us about the future direction of the global economy and globalization. So that's why we were here. Dr. Steinmeier, you said you would be willing to have an intellectual, challenging conversation, that's what you delight in Washington. So I thought that was a little encouragement for us to have a little bit of an intellectual challenge. What I thought I'd do, and we have about 30 minutes or so, and knowing this audience, you're going to be challenged, I assure you of that. What I thought I would do is just take a few minutes, the moderator's prerogative, and begin a very quick dialogue, and then immediately turn it over to you. We have two microphones set up, one up here right in the front and then one in the back. As we're finishing up our little dialogue, please go ahead if you have a question for Dr. Steinmeier. Please go ahead. We'll try to just keep it to 3 deep so we can see you. Please give your name and your affiliation. And because we're a little short on time, just to keep that question very short, but we want to bring you into this conversation. Dr. Steinmeier, as you were speaking, I was reflecting on our own presidential election last fall, particularly on the foreign policy debate. And in fact, there was very little difference in some respects between the two parties. And that actually caused a lot of tension because both parties had to highlight the differences, though they were small. So if I may, I'd like to have you help us pull out the differences between what an SPD foreign policy would look like if successful in September, and help us understand that. And I'd like to begin with Europe. I thought your comments on the debt crisis and European integration were very powerful and important. Last November, you said, and I quote, that SPD would not do anything that could lead to Greece becoming unable to make its payments in the short term or could force it to leave the Eurozone. And you cautious that we would not, in the short term, use political capital. If I substituted the word Cyprus in that statement for Greece, would that statement still hold if, in fact, the Bundestag has to make a decision on a future bailout for Cyprus?
No, that is the reason why I'm coming directly from the IMF here to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and in this discussion, and that is one of the main debates we have in these days in Germany. Over weeks, the front pages of many newspapers were covered by stories of Cyprus, and that were stories that were not very beloved by German citizens, because, you know, there were a lot of stories about money laundering, the activities of the Russian mafia in Cyprus and so on. I'm telling this because you must know, under such circumstances, it is not easy to convince a majority in the German parliament for a further rescue package for Cyprus. And therefore, I made it very clear in the German public that in a situation in which Cyprus is perhaps not the most relevant European economy, we have to talk about conditions. And there are 3 conditions which I mentioned publicly in the German economy. The first condition is that we need decisive steps in Cyprus towards fighting against money laundering. The second issue, from my point of view, is that Cyprus is ready to talk with the European Union about their tax system. The corporate tax is around about 10%, and that's minor than the half of the tax rate in Germany. And the third condition from our social democratic point of view must be that Cyprus is ready to support what we initiated in Europe, financial tax. Transaction tax. Thank you. These are 3 conditions. We had not yet the chance to talk to Cyprus directly, and I don't know if it makes sense in this situation just before the elections in Cyprus. So I think we have to wait until the election day in Cyprus, look into the outcome, hoping that there is some reasonable and responsible leadership in Cyprus, and then we experience if Cyprus is ready to talk about those conditions and ready to implement those further steps.
Let me stay on the integration project for a moment. If you're successful in September, on your watch, we may have a British general election, which brings us to a question of a referendum for the UK to remain in or out of Europe. What's the SPD position about potentially renegotiating the British package, if you will, with Europe?
Yeah. It's a pity what had happened during the last 2-3 years in Europe. I'm one of those who are fighting for a long enduring membership of the United Kingdom in the European Union. And I was really suffering when I heard 2 years ago that our sister party, the Labour Party, was not very much in favor of membership in the European Union. Now, 2 years later, the positions in the British party system are nearly the contrary, because now Mr. Cameron is more or less on a populist position, perhaps not against Europe, but with a lot of skepticism towards Europe. The Labour Party is, in the meanwhile, more pro-European, so therefore there is a chance to keep the majority of the Brits in the European Union, or they're voting for European Union, majority of the voting for the European Union. I myself, and that is not easy to explain, I myself had a conflict with the German government about the question how to implement more budget discipline in the European Union. I don't know if you had the chance to follow this in details, but we talked about changing the treaty, the European treaty in Europe, and I was afraid that with this strategy, by changing the treaty, that this would be or mean a tough way for the Brits. At the end, we agreed in Europe about changing the treaty, implemented all the instruments for more budget discipline, but on the other side, I think we speeded up the trends in Great Britain away from the European Union, and therefore I don't know if it was at the end very reasonable what we did. Not with regard to fiscal discipline, that is what we need, but to implement fiscal discipline by changing the treaty, that is the question where the answer is still open.
The unintended consequences of the debt crisis. Let me move, well, you didn't touch on it in your remarks, but I'd like to move to the Middle East, to North Africa, the Arab awakening. Today we have German troops on the Turkish border surrounding a Patriot battery. What is, briefly, because we're going to get to these questions, what would SPD's view on Syria, on providing a more robust foreign and security policy vis-a-vis the Arab awakening? You can talk about Iran as well in that package if you'd like. I know.
1 hour?
Wrap it up in a minute or so.
No. Very few words about Syria. I were in Syria in 2006 and 2008, I think, and comparing the present situation with the situation in those days, it's a real tragedy. 60,000 to 70,000 people have already died in this conflict, and there is not any successful strategy for us, for the West. And the reason for that is, again, from my point of view, with a little bit knowledge about the region, I think our assessment about the cause, about the reasons for that conflict, were not complete in the beginning. Look into the newspapers in Germany or in the United States. The conflict was described as a conflict between the Syrian leadership and the opposition. That is true. It is a conflict between the leadership and the opposition, and everything is true about the cruelties from the side of the Syrian army. But on the other side, and that is what I experienced during my visits in that region, in the Gulf states, for instance, long before the military conflict in Syria has begun, you could recognize not only a readiness, but also eagerness to find a decision about the conflict between the Shiite or Sunni leadership in the Muslim world. And therefore, my impression, my assessment about the present situation in Syria is that is on the one side a conflict between between the leadership, the Syrian leadership and the opposition, but on the other side, it is also, let's put it in this way, it is a battlefield for a proxy conflict between the Shiite and the Sunni world, Sunni part of the Muslim world, and therefore it is very hard to find strategies for the United Nations or international institution for calming the conflict. We experienced all the attempts of Kofi Annan in the beginning. Now, Ibrahimi and others, I think this is not the way for a solution in Syria. And all the discussion of sending arms in that region is in the same way no contribution to a solution there, because traveling to that region, there are so many arms in Syria, and daily new from outside. There is money, there are arms. I don't know if more arms will bring that conflict to an end.
All right, now I need everyone to start thinking their questions and start lining up. I'm going to ask one follow-up. Just come on up, and then I'll call on you. I want to just a two-finger on your Russia comment. You mentioned the dialogue. You mentioned maintaining, ensuring that there is that Russia needs our help and civil society. German policies, when you were foreign minister, were criticized for being bad for civil society, democracy, that there, in some ways, that the democratic values were placed in a secondary position, perhaps over the economic relationship. How will the Social Democrats, will there be a prioritization over the economic relationship with Russia and lowering of values, or will there be a more prominent place in the human rights, the civil society discourse, as we see so much change, potential change occurring in Russian society today?
You know, that was not true in the past and will not be true in the future. And it is a little bit annoying to discuss those items from the past because, you know, I think, and with all my experience in 11 years of being part of the government and now leader of the opposition, yes, Germany has still contacts to Russia. I cannot remember any year in these last 11 or 15 years in which we were not discussing or not criticizing situation of human rights in Russia. What I wanted to say in my few words here is we have to be very clear about the risks. There is, same in the USA, there is every day a risk to talk to partners with an autocratic leadership or an autocratic system. That is a risk. But, you know, with our experience in Europe, the bigger risk is to let a big neighbor, which Russia is, to let a big neighbor alone. And therefore, you know, there is no policy possible without risks, and you have to compare. And sometimes being courageous, and that is what my advice for foreign policy is, not every day look into the possible headlines of the next day's newspapers, but sometimes following the own analysis.
Very good. All right. Oh, you've got a long line, and here they come. You're sort of, in a baseball analogy, you're sort of like a batter in a batting cage, and they're going to be throwing you some fastballs, some curveballs. So please start throwing them. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Michael Callingard.
Right.
I have two affiliations. One is the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. The other is the Council for the United States and Italy. Mr. Steinmeier, you mentioned in passing the proposal for Transatlantic Free Trade Zone. Of course, this is not a new idea. It has been around and raised at various times and in various forms. The reason it hasn't come to fruition has been that there are very serious impediments to that, obstacles both on the U.S. side and on the European side.
Yeah.
And my question to you is there anything different that gives grounds for optimism that this can actually come to fruition? I know that one thing that seems to be different is that we now have, at the highest levels in both the EU and the US, support for it. Personally, I wonder whether that's sufficient and that we won't find that we go off with great fanfare and at the end we don't accomplish anything.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we take a few questions
Yeah.
and have you bundle them? Sir, while you're standing up there, why don't you go right ahead?
I'm Jerry Livingston from the German Historical Institute. First, let me thank you for a very encouraging talk. And Heather asked us to challenge you, so let me give you two challenges. The main criticisms, I think, in America of Germany are twofold, one of which Pia has already mentioned. The first one is Germany's economy is export-driven, and that's the source of German prosperity. Much more should be done in German economic policy to stimulate domestic demand. Why isn't the government doing more? That's the first question. The second one, I haven't seen Germany called a wimp in the headlines, but Germany is called pacifist all the time in American press headlines. And that goes back to the fact that Germany was not with us on Iraq, as you've mentioned. Germany pulled its ships out of the Mediterranean at the time of Libya for some reason, was not with Libya, and it's done the minimal to be with its closest ally, France, in Mali. So is Germany pacifist?
And Afghanistan and Balkans?
Afghanistan was, 11 years ago now. And that was at a time when the NATO treaty was called into action in Article 5.
We'll take one more question, then we'll let you. That's a full plate. One more question, please.
Okay, Stanley Kober. The former head of Italian military intelligence was just sentenced to 10 years in prison by an Italian court for cooperating with the American program of extraordinary rendition. Several American officials have recently also been convicted in absentia by Italian courts. This issue is now emerging, I suspect, as a major issue of contention.
Italian courts, the renditions of America, the American courts. Correct.
In transatlantic relations.
You're talking about renditions?
Yes.
The rendition.
Yes.
Investigations in other countries are going forward. We talk about NATO as shared values. One of those values in the transatlantic relationship is the rule of law. This suggests that there's a different interpretation of the rule of law emerging. It also raises the prospect that the former head of Italian military intelligence is sentenced, of whether American officials of higher ranks could also be subject to arrest if they visit Europe.
What is your expectation?
Is the question whether this would be an issue that German courts would consider?
I see this as emerging as a major issue
For Germany?
for Europe, for transatlantic relations, the lectures on transatlantic relations.
Commenting on that potential. Okay. Well, you guys weren't kidding. You really did take the challenge. TAFTA, domestic consumption, pacifism, and renditions. You may not come back for a while after we do this to you.
I have to consider a little bit about the first question, so I'm starting with the first.
You can pick and choose.
Free trade agreement. I hope I gave the right signals. I said in my speech that Joe Biden, during his speech in Munich, was arguing for a revitalization of the free trade agreement discussion between the USA and Europe. And revitalization means it's not a new idea. Former idea from former years, which is perhaps where is a chance to revitalize it. I'm completely realistic about the time frame we need for successful negotiations. And I'm completely realistic about the obstacles we have to overcome in those negotiations. So therefore, because I had to comment in the early morning the speech of Barack Obama in the German media. My answer, if the free trade agreement between the USA and Europe will contribute to the growth in Europe, my answer was perhaps yes, but not in the next 2 or 3 years. So therefore, I'm realistic. I hope not too optimistic concerning the time frame, but if there is a political will on both sides of the Atlantic, we should not hesitate and start the process for negotiations. Second questions about the structure of the German economy. You mentioned the importance of our exports, and that is true. And if you listen to my speeches in Germany, what I'm usually saying is our advantage in the German economy is our biggest disadvantage. Better to say, is our biggest risk. Because indeed, our economy is export-driven, and now in these days, when the European economy is suffering, the German economy is hit by those stagnation or recession in parts of Europe. And whatever you learn about the increasing economic relations between Germany and China, the figures are we are exporting 60% of our products from Germany to the neighborship in the European Union, round about 60% in our neighborship, and 6% to China. That is the difference, and therefore that is the reason why I said we cannot abstain, we cannot be indifferent with regard to the European crisis and the lack of demand from the southern part of Europe. We are depending from that by greater parts. Are we able to compensate the lack of demand from others by strengthening the national demand? That is possible, yes. But you're now between two aims. On the one side, we made our structural reforms. Why? 10 years ago, why? Because we have lost our competitiveness. That was the reason for structural reforms after which we lost our majority in the elections and the majority. And therefore, I'm greeting you now as a leader of the opposition. Meaning structural reforms, being responsible for structural reforms is a real political risk. But we did that because in those days, you have that in your memory, Germany was the sick man of Europe. We have lost our competitiveness, and we had to reform our institutions to create growth again and to regain competitiveness for our German companies. That is the one side, the one goal. The other goal is to create more demand inside Germany. And when I say this, then these are very different goals. What I learned in my practice, political practice during the last 2 decades, you have to find a path with which you are not taking the risk to cancel the first goal. Meaning, strengthen the demand in Germany is not allowed if it leads to losing our competitiveness, which we have re-strengthened 10 years ago. So therefore, we are looking to the development of wages in Germany. Wages in Germany are not decided by political institutions. It's a bargaining process by the associations of business companies on the one side and trade unions on the other side. And what we experienced since 3 years now, the wages are really increasing. So there is a little bit better demand now than in comparison to situation 5 or 10 years ago. But indeed, that's not yet enough. And therefore, you're right, we need more domestic demand. But it's not easy, that is my answer, but it's not easy to create this domestic demand without canceling our first goal to keep and strengthen our competitiveness. And the last question about renditions. Yeah, I have my serious experiences because. Sorry? Yeah, because I spent around about 4 years in an yes. No. Untersuchungsausschuss. I spent around about 4 years in a commission of inquiry in the German parliament and had to give complicated answers. All answers about the German role in a conflict in which we not contributed militarily, but in which German or airports of the Americans were situated, located in Germany, and there was a link to German authorities. And I know that that was a very critical discussion. The European Parliament was upset about what was reported in the European newspapers. There were some rumors about rendition places in Eastern Europe and so on. I think we all have to learn from that, and such a practice, beside or without legitimacy, cannot be continued in the future.
If you can take 2 more questions and then quickly answer them, I promise we get everybody home promptly. So here we go. Last 2 questions. Yes, sir.
Well, my name is Raoul Bessems. I'm with the Netherlands Embassy, or Dutch Embassy as someone preferred. Mr. Steinmeier, thank you for your comments. I shall indeed keep it brief because people seem to have other very important meetings. You mentioned in your comments the importance of course, of the free trade agreement. You also mentioned the importance of the outlook to Asia for Europe, that Europe should look to Asia and should keep investing in that. My question would be the following. Since the US government and Clinton in November, Biden recently, I think even Kerry mentioned it, the pivot to Asia that the US wants to make, they want to make it together with Europe. It's not just that Europe should see it that Europe should fear it, but as something to be made together with the US. How do you see that? Do you see the outlook from Europe to Asia as
Cooperation on Asia.
Yes, the European look to Asia. Do you see that as something besides the US or something to be made together with the US?
Mm-hmm.
Great. And the final question of the evening.
Hi, I'm Alex Racy. I'm a master's student up at American University. Mr. Steinmeier, thank you very much. And my question is, Herman van Rompuy has highlighted youth unemployment as being a major problem in the European Union. It's also a major consequence of the sovereign debt crisis. My question is, what is the SPD's stance on further harmonizing employment strategy throughout Europe through mechanisms such as the European Employment Strategy? Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah,
And on an important issue. Dr. Steinmeier.
important and not easy to answer. Perhaps with one or two sentences back to our situation in Germany. 10 years ago, we were at the end of the growth rate in whole Europe, on the last place. Our unemployment was increasing from 3 million to 3.5 and 4 million, 4.5 million. And in January or February 2006, 1 to 5 million unemployment. And that was a situation in which we knew in the government nothing to do means that the unemployment will increase further, perhaps to 6 or 7 million. And 6 or 7 million unemployees in Germany wouldn't have not only an economic consequence, but I'm afraid also a political consequence. And therefore, that was the reason why we tried to create a complete turnaround in the German economy, in the welfare system, in the health system, and so on. I'm saying that because we made 3 experiences. What you need is, on the first hand, budget discipline. That is needed. You need, secondly, the readiness and the courage for structural reform. But with these 2 activities, you will never be successful if you have not growth in the third step. And therefore, that is part of the answer to your question was concerning youth unemployment. You shouldn't lose growth in such a situation. And whatever was right in all European rescue package, whatever was right, wrong was that we were not courageous enough to take enough time and to engage more by supporting growth in Europe. And now in a situation with 50% or 60% youth unemployment in Spain, in Greece, and in the southern part of Italy, it's hard to create a complete turnaround in that situation. What I know, it takes very much longer time as we needed in Germany. Our turnaround, what I'm talking about, our turnaround in Germany needed round about 10 years. From the beginning of the first decade of this century until the end. At the end of the first decade, we were again on board, economically spoken. But you need round about 8 to 10 years. And the basis now in the Mediterranean member states is very much lower than in the situation in Germany 10 years ago. Europe and Asia, that is one of my favorite issues I'm talking about here in my political meetings, because I think there are a lot of misunderstandings, not only in the USA but also on the European side when we are talking about the American pivot to Asia. The same debate in Germany would be a long lamento about new strategies here in the USA, leaving Europe alone, losing interest in the old partner and friend Europe and so on. It's a huge lamento in Europe. And my position is a little bit different because I'm saying it is not true that America is changing only a strategy. More important is that the reality has changed. And therefore, from my point of view, it is necessary that the USA is taking care concerning everything what happens in Eastern Asia. And what I'm saying in my public speeches in Europe, from the European point of view, it may be a risk that the transatlantic partnership is not as close as it was in the 50s or in the 60s. That's true, that is a risk. But the bigger risk for Europe is that the USA doesn't care about Eastern Asia. And therefore, my position is it is in our interest, not that the USA is turning away from Europe, but it is in our interest that the USA is taking care of what happens in Eastern Asia. And therefore, it's completely my position, or let's say my conviction. There is a huge chance for cooperation between the USA and Europe by finding a common position to all developments in Eastern Asia. Many thanks.
Dr. Steinmeier, thank you so much. We really put you through your paces, and you did great. Let me thank you all for being with us this evening. Thanks to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, to the Women's National Democratic Club, and have a great night. Thank you all so much. Thank you. You did great.